take a look a little bit, very quickly, the background as I see it in coaching. Who remembers the 1980s as an adult? A few people in here. I remember it very well. I had hair then. It was 15 or 20 kilos lighter. Not sure why that's happening. But the 80s, the 1980s, for those of us who were in the business world at that time, it was slow. We had time to develop. We had people who were willing to work with us and support us in our growth. We had, internally, we had people who were concerned about where our next assignment was. Our next assignment may come in every 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years. Product development. A product would come on stage, it would last for sometimes 4 or 5 years before a new product needed to be developed or a new service needed to be developed. So the 1980s were about slow. They were about really focusing inward and taking the time to grow and develop. But towards the late 1980s, something began to happen. And what began to happen is that we began to look at how do we support people more effectively, a little bit closer to what they needed to do to grow and develop. So in the 1980s, we began to see this thing called, late 1980s, this thing called executive coaching. Executive coaching came into the marketplace, came into the business world through sports. Began to use lots of sports analogies, and it was a response to behavioralist capabilities. So in sports, we believed that if you did something well and you wanted to do it better, you just simply had to practice and do it more. So the idea was, well, if we came into the business world, could we take that same kind of thing? Could we get to talk to people about what they needed to do to develop and practice enough that they would become better at what they did, whether that's in relationships or strategic thinking or whatever it might be. We said, well, if we had somebody that could come in and actually coach and use this behavioralist technique, this might be better. So this idea of executive coaching came in because we felt that if we could get a person to work one-on-one and we could understand better what the issues were, we could develop a process where we would practice it and get better. In the early 1990s, that really started from a remedial standpoint. Some of you may recall this. A coach would come in, and if you were being coached by an executive coach, it was, to a degree, a stigma. It sort of said, oh no, I'm not doing well, you need to be coached. So it was remedial. We had to fix something. There was a developmental issue. And the 1990s were sort of put in that way. Mid-1990s in the United States, where coaching started, that began to shift. That began to shift to the idea that coaching really, if we can get to an executive who's done well, how do we keep them doing it well and then even get better? How do we give them that edge? This article that some of you may have read talked a lot about how do we get that edge for that executive. So coaching began to shift that way. Actually, when I started coaching in around 2000 here in Singapore, it was on that beginning curve. A lot of our work was in that remedial area. Some of our work was with young executives who were growing and developing. But that switched here in Singapore at about 2005. There was a distinct shift when people began to say, we need to either get closer earlier on to people before they start to derail, or with our senior people who are doing well, let's get a coach with them so we can develop them even further, that they can build greater capacity. So the 1990s saw huge changes in executive coaching. Still very important to do some work with developmental, but the process really began to shift much more to the area of continued growth, taking an executive to that next level. So the result of all of that, 20 plus years later now, coaching is now considered the #1 intervention for leadership development. So it has had tremendous strides in its early gestation. What got it to this point? Well, what happened was that we began to see that coaching can affect on a more quicker basis. All of you are probably responsible for leadership development workshops where you bring 20, 30 executives in. Those are all very valuable and still need to be done. But generally, when those are finished, only a certain amount of that learning stays with you over a period of time. In fact, the statistics are going to say only about 22% of the learning from a workshop will stick with you after 6 months. If you use an executive coach, someone who's one-on-one with you for that same period of 6 months after a leadership development workshop, that retention goes up to 88%. So what we see is a real value in this one-on-one approach. And that was beginning to become understood in the late 1990s and 2000, and that's the reason now that it's considered the #1 intervention for leadership development, because it has so much value. This report and many other reports are out now that look at executive coaching for return on investment. And the return on investment is sometimes at the low end 3 times what you pay a coach, you'll get that much back, and all the way up to as much as 10 times. Many white papers have been done on executive coaching. So executive coaching is no longer the fad, the one-on-one. It's beyond the fad. It is the best intervention for long-term development because it supports so directly an individual.